Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our monthly webinar series. This month is about COVID-19 equity and mobility. Please be reminded that we are recording this webinar series. So the first presentation is about the effect of COVID-19 on mobility and equity, a case study on transit users in Baltimore, Maryland. This project is a UMEC core project that me and Dr. Chavis have been working on that, and our PhD students, Samira and Istiak, have been helping us. So we looked at different ways of seeing the effect of COVID on transit riders. We did a survey questionnaire. We looked at the national data, look at Google and Apple, and MTA ridership data. I will go on the survey questionnaire. This is still ongoing. We prepared two survey questionnaires, one for transit riders and one for transit operators. What I'm reporting here is only on transit riders. So we send this questionnaire online through our social media, emails, and we haven't received as many as we wanted to, so we are pushing more and more on it to get more responded. So these are the results of 80 transit riders that responded our survey questionnaire. So over 80% are Maryland residents, and the gender is almost half and half. An age group, we have more of 25 to 34-year-old people who responded, and the race is majority white, and then Black, and then Hispanic, Asian, and then Hispanic. The education level, interestingly, they are more of higher education. 37% are bachelor degrees, and 48% are master's or PhD over, they are higher degrees. The annual income is majority over 100K of annual income. The type of houses, the majority are either on the single family house or apartment, and number of cars per household, 33% do not have any cars, and 36% have only one car. So they are the ones who are using transit. We asked them if they have been exposed, they have been confirmed COVID-19 themselves or their household family members. Only 5% they were not sure, or somebody in their household got COVID-19. We asked if they were worried about COVID-19 pandemic. 55% are moderately worried, 39% are very worried, and so the rest are small, but we see that people are concerned about COVID-19. We asked them if after the COVID-19 is no longer a threat, how they will do those activities compared to before COVID. So if you look at the about the same is the first column, and different activities is going to movie theater, online meetings, online shopping, and social gathering, teleworking, and travel. So about the same is mostly, a lot of them, they're going to do about the same, all but online meeting. But when you look at much less than before, going to movie theaters, going to be much less than before. People got used to watching from their TV, and so many different apps and websites that they can watch. Somehow less than before, going to movie theaters and social gatherings and travel, gonna be somewhat less than before COVID, after the COVID is no more threat. Somewhat more is online meetings and teleworking and also online shopping. So people like to stay at home and work from home. So even after COVID, they would rather work from home. And substantially more than before, again, online meetings and teleworking. So that's very interesting. And that's the same one we show it in a different way. The somewhat less than before is social gathering and going to the movie theater and travel. And the same is online shopping is more of the same. And substantially more than before is teleworking and online meetings. Employment status just before COVID and during the COVID, those 80 people who responded to our survey did not lose their jobs. So 68% were full-time as opposed to 65% still full-time. Interestingly, student, we had 16% student and employed, that reduced to 11%. So probably they took a break from school because of COVID. And also retired, it was 6% retired and it became 10% retired. Maybe because of COVID, they decided to retire, it's time to retire. How often do you commute to work before COVID? It was 76%. They were commuting every day to work, and that reduced to 14%. And partial commute was 22%, reduced to 16%. Teleworking was only 2%, and now increased to 70%. So most of the responded, they just switched from commuting every day to teleworking, and they kept their jobs. How long was their commute before COVID? 86% was more than 40 minutes of commute. And now it's only 3% that they still do that long commute. During the COVID, 78% have zero commute, which is teleworking. And between 20 to 40 minutes was 4%. It increased to 11%. And less than 20 minutes almost stayed the same. What type of public transit do you use? So we categorize into 3 main categories of bus, light rail, and metro subway. And bus increased the percentage of those people who are using public transit. It's somehow they switch from light rail and metro to bus. But in the next part that we are looking at the ridership and all those, you will see more how this dynamic is happening. We asked about when they are in the transit, how was the situation before and during the COVID? Like the transit has only standing room. It was 45% was often and 45% was occasionally just having standing room, and that changed to 65% never. So because the ridership decreased, plus because of the COVID rules that people cannot be close to each other. Someone is seated next to me. It was over 46% was often, and now it changed to 62% never. Nobody's sitting next to them. And a small percentage, 22% occasionally and 12% often. And unable to maintain 6 feet distance was 53% was occasionally, and now it's 52% is never. Able to maintain 6 feet distance, it was 42% never and 46% occasionally. That changed to 42% always. They can able to maintain that 6 feet distance. So we can say it's pretty much safe, maybe. At least we can see they follow the protocols for the most part. Frequency of using public transit for their activities during the COVID compared to before. So for the work trips, only 11% is about the same. 81% they are doing less often during the COVID. So in most of the activities, they're doing way less often than before. Medical is not as, that less often percentage is not as much as others, because if you don't have your car and you have to do your medical services, you have to use public transit. And more often during the COVID, even medical is more than others, 7.5%, they're doing even more than before using transit, public transit. That is pretty much it for the survey. We are working on the survey for transit operators to see what is their experience and what they're doing. We also, we are expanding our transit rider survey, and hopefully in the next few months, we're gonna have more results. I give the rest to Dr. Chavis to talk about MTA peer agency analysis with NTD data. Dr. Chavis.
Thank you. And actually, is it possible for me to share my screen just so I can point? And...
Sure, let me.
Yes, you should be able to share it.
I have to stop my share. And I don't know how to. My screen is so small and I cannot. Okay, stop sharing.
Thank you. Okay, so in this part, we looked at the National Transit Database data and looked at MTA Maryland, which primarily serves the Baltimore region, as well as their self-defined peer agencies. So they have 9 agencies with which they consider to be peer. We took the agencies that they use in the regional transportation plan that's under development right now. And so you can see the agencies that we looked at, and I'll refer to them by their city that they primarily serve, such as St. Louis, Denver, Minneapolis, Houston, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Portland, Salt Lake City, and DC. So DC is a bit of an anomaly in this list. You'll see that they are a much larger agency, WMATA, than MTA Maryland is. But because they are our neighboring agency, MTA looks at them as well as a peer agency. So what we did was we looked at the unlinked passenger trip data from the National Transit Database for each of these agencies. And we looked at it by comparing February 2020, which is what we're using as our baseline before COVID, and comparing the changes in ridership each month for each of the agencies. So unlinked passenger trips would be, let's say you take a bus and then you make a transfer to another bus, that would count as 2 unlinked passenger trips. So they're not it's not looking at a journey, it's looking at each individual trip made on a particular transit mode. And so you can see Baltimore or MTA Maryland in this third column, and you can see DC here in the last column. What's really interesting is looking at the difference between bus and rail for each agency as well. And so what we have here is you can see in March when the pandemic first began, we were starting to see declines in bus ridership across the board. But in April, once the stay-at-home orders were in place, you can see the really steep decline in ridership. So what's really interesting is comparing the decline in bus ridership for DC compared to Baltimore. So you can see DC had a decline of 82%. So that's comparing April to February 2020. Whereas for the same month, Baltimore only had a 53% decline. And you can see that the worst month for each agency is highlighted. And as you see, St. Louis and Baltimore and Houston, relatively speaking, did not decline as much, whereas DC experienced the steepest decline in bus ridership, and that was in the month of April. St. Louis was interesting that their worst month happened to be in June, where generally across the board, April tended to be the worst month for bus ridership. DC, while they did experience a really steep decline in April and May in bus trips, we do see that there is this recovery that has occurred. And by the time December came around, ridership was only down by about 53% compared to the worst part of 82%. Baltimore has maintained a comparatively high ridership, but you can see that August was the best during the pandemic with a decline of around 38%, but then we start to see the decline worsen in the later months of the year. And when we look at the service, we'll talk more about why perhaps this decline we see. Now looking at rail, you can see that Baltimore and DC have very similar trends. And this makes sense, particularly because a lot of the rail service, particularly MARC train service, is connecting the Baltimore and DC regions together. So you can see the really steep impact on rail with over 90% declines for both Baltimore and DC. Similar things happen in Pittsburgh as well. Now you can see the rail for the other agencies were not necessarily as bad, particularly in St. Louis, Houston, and Cleveland. The amount of rail service does vary quite a bit amongst these agencies, so it's probably quite difficult to really compare. For example, of course, Amada has a really large subway system. Here in Baltimore, we have one metro line, light rail line, and then our commuter rail, which connects to DC. You can see that for rail, April, of course, was generally the worst month, except for in Minneapolis, it was in June. But what's really interesting here, I think, is Baltimore has the biggest difference between bus and rail service, which kind of highlights the idea of different riders taking those two modes together. So here we're looking at a service measure being the vehicle revenue hours, once again comparing to February 2020 as our pre-COVID baseline. And we also looked at vehicle revenue miles. They, of course, are highly correlated, so we're just presenting vehicle revenue hours here today. And so this is looking at the total number of vehicle hours that was in service for each of these agencies. And so despite Baltimore having a pretty high bus ridership compared to some of the other agencies, we were actually more aggressive in our cuts, fairly aggressive in our cuts to service. Now you can see DC, reflective of the really steep bus ridership declines that they had early on, did cut their bus service quite a bit, but then it has been restored since the fall. what's really interesting is just how different agencies have responded to the challenges that have been posed by the pandemic. So we know that these declines in ridership, of course, is providing some really difficult decisions that have to be made in terms of how do you balance your budget. And so you can see that there's been many different approaches being made. So DC, for example, made steep cuts early on and then has restored service. Baltimore's bus cuts have been pretty consistent since the start of the pandemic. But then other cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland have been a bit more, they haven't really cut their bus service despite ridership declines. So they've been prioritizing that service in their cities. And you can see other places like St. Louis took steep cuts and then have been gradually restoring service a bit. So in the end, at the end of the year in December, Denver had the steepest percentage decrease in vehicle revenue hours, followed by Baltimore. And here at, in the chart below, we are looking at the decline for rail service in vehicle revenue hours. So you can see for Baltimore, we have maintained our cuts in rail service. And if anyone had followed some of the service changes that were initially proposed, initially there were supposed to be more cuts to the bus service. And the advocacy community really used the fact that Baltimore was pretty resilient when it came to the pandemic compared to other cities as a way of trying to keep the bus service. And so despite the fact that this looks like we have a pretty steep decline, it was actually going to be a bit worse. And so what the agency did was, in order to try to balance those gaps that are due to lost revenue due to COVID, they've actually maintained pretty steep cuts to rail service in order to try to maintain more service to the bus system. And that was a direct result of looking at those ridership changes between those modes. So you can see DC, on the other hand, has restored service in both bus and rail. And then you can see places like Portland never really changed their service throughout their pandemic. Many places have really maintained their rail service. And this may be because it's may maintain a fairly small portion of their budget if rail service is pretty limited. So they may not see where cutting rail service may have much of a budgetary impact. But you can see really here the stance that MTA Maryland made compared to other agencies. So this one is vehicles operated in maximum service. And so this is looking at during peak periods, how many vehicles are operating. And we looked at this to try to get an idea of if agencies really did across the board cuts, but try to maintain their service hours, or did they make cuts at particular time periods, particularly in the peak periods, to save money? And so you can see, we'll start with Baltimore again. Early on, they did make cuts to peak service by cutting it by about in half in terms of the number of vehicles operated during maximum service. And they're still maintained some cuts in the peak service. Once again, you can see DC made cuts in the summer and then kind of restored some of the service for bus in the fall months. Other places like Cleveland saw no change in the number of vehicles that were being operated during the peak periods, similarly in St. Louis as well. Here you can see down below for rail, and there's quite a bit of variability amongst our peer agencies. So DC did not really change peak service number of vehicles, though the cars may have been different lengths during the pandemic. But you can see here, for example, Baltimore had really steep cuts, restored quite a bit, and then made additional cuts at the end of the year. Whereas Denver has been pretty consistent. And so this just gets this just allows us to start looking at how each agency is really trying to play that game of balancing service and providing service with responding to budgetary constraints. So next, what we did was we ran a regression on this data, and we also incorporated the unemployment rate in each of these cities. So here you can see roughly 2 years worth of unemployment rates. Of course, here in April and May is the peak of the pandemic. In Baltimore, it's shown by the black line here. And so you can see for the region, we weren't as bad compared to other areas, but of course, this isn't as nuanced in terms of looking at different income groups and so forth. So we performed this regression where we looked at the median income in each area, the unemployment rate each month, as well as the vehicle revenue hours of service and the vehicles operating during maximum service. And we ran this regression on our dependent variable, which was the percentage change in unlinked passenger trips. And so we separated by bus and rail, and the results were pretty interesting. When you look at bus, vehicle revenue hours was not significant. And so that aligns with what we know about buses often being used by riders who are deemed more captive, where they don't have alternatives to using transit. And so despite the fact that, so what we see is that it wasn't very sensitive to the change in vehicle revenue hours. So the sign made sense that it was positive, that more vehicle revenue hours would mean a positive increase in unlinked passenger trips, but it was not significant. However, bus trips was significant to the median income of the region of study, as well as the unemployment rate. So as the unemployment rate increases, unlinked passenger trips decreases. Now for rail on the other hand, rail was sensitive to the service measures of vehicle revenue hours and vehicles operating in maximum service. And so you can see that more revenue hours resulted in more of a positive increase in unlinked passenger trips, whereas income and employment rate were also significant, where higher income resulted in less rail trips, and a higher unemployment rate also resulted in less rail trips. So then we looked at some of the mobility data that's been publicly provided by Google and Apple, and they look at slightly different things. So the first one is Apple routing data requests. And so this is looking at how many requests Apple has been getting for routing, and they divided it by transit and driving requests. And what they did was look at the percentage change when the baseline being January 13th, 2020. I'm not sure how they chose that particular day, but that was the baseline day. And so you can see each of our cities here. Baltimore is the blue line that's a little bit thicker here. And so you can see this decline in transit requests during the stay-at-home orders, and then they kind of rose in the summer, and then all cities tended to kind of taper off a little bit in the later months. And so we still needed to investigate more about why this would be. Perhaps it could be that, a lot of service adjustments are being made, and now people are more familiar with the service, and they may not need to check as much for routing requests. Could also be due to weather changes and seasonal changes. So we need to explore that a bit more. In terms of driving requests, this has been really interesting. So while transit has still seen a decline relative to that base day of January 13th, we see that there was an increase in routing requests for driving in the summer months, and now we've kind of tapered back to the baseline of 0, where we're kind of as we were before the pandemic in terms of routing requests made by Apple. And you can see Baltimore kind of falls in the middle of the pack here. Now looking at the Google mobility data, so this data is not actually just requests, it's looking at, you know, when you use Google Maps, you sign on to having them tracking you in the background. And so they looked at different trip destinations and used a baseline. They had a baseline that was the median day that occurred for a 5-week period for that day of the week from January 3rd to February 6th. And so here we can see transit. And because it was at the county level, we did not look yet at all of the peer agencies. So right now I'm just showing Baltimore with 4 others. So Hennepin is the Minneapolis County, of course, Denver, Colorado, Portland, Oregon, and then Salt Lake City. So you can see here that Baltimore had a much higher rate of transit trips compared to the baseline, compared to the other cities of interest in both the weekday and the weekend. So I separated it by weekday and weekend to see if there was any differences. It's interesting that the weekend trips by transit did not decrease by as large of amount as the weekday trips. And then this is just diving into Baltimore specifically. So the Google mobility data had several different trip purposes. So what I presented before was transit, which is shown by the black line on both the weekday and weekend graph. But they also had retail, grocery and pharmacy, parks, residential, and workplace. And so, of course, during the pandemic, the one thing that was safe was to be outside. And so we can see the increase in park trips that occurred. And if also people were doing small gatherings at home and working from home. So the residential trips remain either constant or were slightly higher than the baseline months. For all others, you can see, of course, workplace trips were down quite a bit. Of course, the weekday ones were down more than the weekend workplace trips, which may be an indicator of the different types of labor industries where you would be working on weekdays versus weekend. And then you can also see retail was down, and as was grocery and pharmacy didn't decline by as much, but we did see a slight decline in grocery and pharmacy trips. So those kind of essential need trips. And so that kind of completes the peer agency analysis. And so where we're going from here is we want to be able to kind of dive much deeper into looking at where ridership changes have taken place and looking at how service has changed. And so this is kind of ongoing, but we requested stop level ridership data from MTA. And we really wanted to look at where ridership has been relatively high, where we've seen the steepest declines, and also kind of comparing that to how they've made their service adjustments in a more nuanced way. And so this is just showing you the ridership data in February, April during the peak of the pandemic, and then in October. And then this box here is zooming in on the heart of downtown. And so you can see the stops that have the most daily average total ridership for that month, and I believe this is just weekdays, are shown with larger circles than those with less. So of course you see in February, pre-pandemic downtown, April in the midst of the pandemic, and then kind of where we were at in October in terms of the ridership. And so what we plan on doing next is looking at land use, looking at where hospitals and different key industries are, and really linking that to the ridership changes that we've seen across the city. Other thing of interest is crowding on transit. So here we're showing the maximum load at each stop. So this would be the maximum number of people who are on a bus at that stop for the day. So you can see this was before the pandemic, in the heart of the pandemic, and then later on. And so you can see that there's probably some routes where there may be more crowding than others. And so that's one thing that we also plan to look at in the future. And then of course, even though we focus a lot on bus trips, just because that's really the heart of service here in Baltimore, we will of course look at our other modes, such as separating out commuter bus service, looking at light rail service, the metro, as well as the MARC trains. But here you can see the MARC train service for 2020 going from January to September at the time. And so the Penn line is the one that links Baltimore to DC. It's the major line on the MARC train service. And you can see how steep of the decline that we had flowing from February down to April. So from 500,000 in monthly ridership to just over 20,000. And all the lines showed pretty consistent trends in terms of the change in ridership between the Penn line, the Brunswick line, as well as the Camden line. And so we're going to continue to monitor to see how that recovery goes with rail service. And so just some other next steps in the future, we really want to link what we see in terms of the ridership shift to socioeconomic data. And we plan on performing like an equity gap analysis where we look at where we see the most ridership, where there's the most need, and comparing that to where service is and how it's been changing. And then using that to maybe provide some recommendations for how we can adjust service in the future, knowing that difficult decisions do have to be made right now. And so seeing if we can provide a framework for how to make those decisions based on what we've seen in the shifts in ridership. So with that, thank you. And we will take any questions that you have.
Oscar Barton here. Great presentations, ladies. I think it was quite interesting in the context of mobility. I just want to first start with Dr. Jahani. You gave a number of statistics, but I wasn't sure of the sample size used in your statistics, and if that sample size was reasonable to conclude some of the conclusions you draw that you presented. You're muted.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. No, our sample size is small, very small. We have 80 transit riders, but because it's ongoing, and so we are sending the survey more and more to people. Actually, we are using Qualtrics now to help us to get more participants, because the first question that we ask is, there are more transit riders or car drivers, and if there are car drivers, most of these questions are irrelevant. So we have to find transit riders, the ones that are majority transit riders. But we are working on it, and we're going to have, more participants, and also transit operators.
So what are you trying to do to increase that pool of folks? I mean, how are you going to do that?
So we are using a company now because we did our own, and it's a survey fatigue, especially COVID-related survey fatigue. So many people sending questionnaires, so people are tired of it, it seems. So now we hired a company to target transit riders for us.
Great, okay, thanks. Thanks, Doc. One follow-up for Dr. Chavis. You cited several cities. What drew your focus on those cities, and how would that impact your studies if you change those cities?
So we use the cities that MTA uses for their regional transportation plan.
Okay. Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, yeah, this is Rick Gordon. I have a question. Can you hear me? Okay, your survey sample, even though it was small, was very reflective of what we've experienced here in Annapolis. Now we're much smaller, but the numbers were very close. You mentioned that you were going to be doing an operator survey. I would only ask that you we'd like to participate if at all possible. I have about 40 drivers here, 40 operators. I'd like to get them involved. And there was one other thing. A question I thought that may come up. We've lost 60% of our ridership over the past year. I'd like to know from riders, what would it take to get them back to transit? As an example, we've installed driver barriers. We have seat back barriers. We sanitize our buses daily. We've marked the seats to sort of emphasize social distancing, and we're prepared to put additional buses out if the ridership dictates that. But I'd be most interested in knowing how riders felt about what it would take to get them back in the system. Thank you.
That's an interesting question. I've been wondering if it's really about transit and safety as much as other things such as, working from home, kids not being in school and they need to be home with them. So that's something that we should definitely consider for the survey, trying to look a little bit more nuanced at that.
Yes, and thank you very much, Mr. Gordon. We would love to have your transit operators for our survey. And I believe we had some questions about how comfortable they are, or sanitizer and stuff. We didn't put it in here, but we have some questions related to that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. We have over 15 minutes for the until the next speaker.